a reclusive millionaire, returned from a decade of self-imposed exile, was paralyzed by the sight of his young nephew huddled on the cold, marble doorstep with two swaddled newborns in a wicker basket. The note pinned to the boy's thin jacket, written in an elegant, dismissive script, was a chilling contrast to the child's shivering frame and the silent, imposing grandeur of the mansion behind him. Why would a child be left like discarded luggage on the very threshold of his own home? And who was truly responsible for the silence that screamed from his impossibly old eyes? Arthur Vance felt the biting November wind cut through his tailored coat, but the chill that seized him originated deeper, in a place of old grief and rising dread. He had been away too long. 10 years spent building an empire on foreign shores, all to numb the pain of losing his younger sister, Elena. He had left her son, Leo, in the care of their cousin, Isabella Thorne, trusting in the bonds of family. He had paid for everything, the upkeep of this palatial home, a generous stipend, anything Isabella requested for the boy's welfare. Now, standing at the wrought iron gates he had just unlocked, he saw the catastrophic failure of that trust. The house stood perfect and proud, its manicured lawns pristine, its windows gleaming like vacant eyes. It was a picture of wealth and order, yet it felt corrupted, a beautiful tomb where life had been suffocated. Nothing about the scene was right. The silence was too profound, the stillness too absolute for a home that should have echoed with a child's laughter. His heart, a long dormant thing, began to beat with a slow, heavy drum of rage. He had come home to reconnect, to finally assume the role of uncle he had for so long neglected. He had not expected to arrive at the scene of a quiet, unfolding horror. He started walking up the long slate path, each step a hammer blow against the icy composure he had maintained for years. The boy Leo didn't move. He just watched Arthur's approach, his small face a mask of stoic resignation that had no place on a child of 5. The closer Arthur got, the more the brutal details sharpened into focus. Leo's jacket was too thin for the encroaching dusk, his sneakers worn at the toes. His hands were red and raw from the cold, but it was the basket beside him that made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. Inside, nestled in a pair of threadbare blankets, were 2 tiny infants, their faces pale and still. For one horrifying, suspended moment, he was sure they were not breathing. He dropped to his knees, his expensive trousers soaking up the damp from the stone, and gently touched a tiny cheek. It was cold as ice, but then he saw it. A faint, shallow puff of condensation in the air. They were alive. Barely. Relief warred with a fresh wave of fury that was so intense it made his vision swim. He looked at the note pinned to Leo's chest. The paper was crisp, expensive stationery. Had to run an urgent errand for the charity gala. It read, "Be a good boy and watch your new sisters. Don't bother Uncle Arthur." The casual cruelty, the sheer, breathtaking selfishness of the words, struck him like a physical blow. Don't bother Uncle Arthur. She had known he was coming. This wasn't just neglect. It was a calculated act of abandonment, a message. He looked from the note to Leo's face. The boy's expression hadn't changed. He was a silent sentinel, a tiny soldier left to stand guard over a post he couldn't possibly defend. In that instant, something shifted within Arthur Vance. The reclusive businessman, the haunted brother who had fled his past, died on that doorstep. In his place, a protector was born. He made a quiet, internal vow, a promise to the ghost of his sister and to the 3 small, vulnerable lives before him. I will not let this stand. I will protect them, and I will uncover every last shred of the truth. With a tenderness he hadn't known he still possessed, Arthur unpinned the note and slipped it into his pocket. Felt like evidence. He gently scooped up the wicker basket, the weight of the 2 infants almost negligible, a terrifying testament to their fragility. "Come on, Leo," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. He reached for the boy's hand. It was as cold as he'd feared. Leo flinched almost imperceptibly at the contact, but then allowed his small fingers to be engulfed by Arthur's. He didn't speak. He just watched, his gaze unwavering. Arthur used his own key to open the massive oak door. The The foyer was immaculate, a cavern of polished marble and cold, recessed lighting. There were no toys in sight, no stray shoes, no colorful drawings taped to the walls. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom, a sterile stage set for a life that wasn't being lived. The air was still and frigid. He immediately took the children into the grand living room, turning up the thermostat until the heating system roared to life. He laid the basket near the fireplace and, after a moment's hesitation, retrieved a cashmere throw from a nearby sofa, tucking it gently around the infants. He then called his private physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose discretion was as renowned as his medical skill. "Alistair, I need you at my sister's old house on Bellevue Avenue. Now, it's an emergency. 2 newborns, exposure, possibly malnourished." He listened for a moment. "No, I don't know the details. Just get here." He hung up and turned his attention back to Leo, who was standing stiffly in the middle of the room, as if afraid to touch anything. Arthur knelt before him. "Are you hungry?" Leo gave a small, hesitant nod. Arthur led him to the kitchen, another monument to sterile perfection, and found it nearly bare. He eventually located a box of crackers and a carton of milk. As the boy ate, Isabella returned. She swept in through the back door, a whirlwind of perfume and feigned panic, her face a perfect mask of concern. "Oh my goodness, Arthur. You're here. I was so worried. There was a terrible crisis at the fundraiser. My phone died. You wouldn't believe it. I had to rush out." She reached for the children, her smile brittle. Arthur stepped in her way, his body a solid, immovable wall. "They're staying with me tonight," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. Her mask slipped. For a single, unguarded second, a flash of pure fury ignited in her eyes, before being expertly extinguished and replaced with a look of wounded understanding. "Of course, Arthur. If you think that's best. You must think I'm a terrible guardian." Arthur moved the children that night, not to a hotel, but to his own sprawling penthouse apartment downtown, a place of quiet security and warmth. Dr. Finch had arrived and confirmed his fears. The twin girls were premature, underweight, and suffering from mild hypothermia. They would survive, he assured Arthur, but they needed immediate and constant care. Within hours, Arthur had arranged for a round-the-clock pediatric nurse, a quiet, capable woman named Sarah, who transformed a guest suite into a fully equipped nursery. Leo was given a room filled with every toy a boy could dream of, but he touched none of them. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, watching the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a small, silent shadow in a world of luxury. Arthur knew that accusations and anger would get him nowhere with a woman as practiced in deception as Isabella. He needed facts. He needed proof. His protective rage had cooled, solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. He would build a case, piece by piece, until her lies had nowhere left to hide. He started the next morning with the neighbors of his sister's house. Most were polite but distant, unwilling to speak ill of the prominent Isabella Thorne, the tireless charity organizer. But one, an elderly widow named Margaret Gable who had lived on the street for 50 years, saw the desperate sincerity in Arthur's eyes. He found her tending her small, meticulous rose garden. "I don't want to cause any trouble," she began, her hands trembling as she snipped at a stray leaf. "Isabella, she's very important around here. A real pillar of the community," they say. Arthur didn't press. He simply stood there, a silent testament to the trouble that had already been caused. He spoke of his sister, Elena, and his voice was thick with a grief he had suppressed for a decade. He told Mrs. Gable about finding Leo on the doorstep. The old woman's face crumpled. "Oh, that poor dear," she whispered, finally looking at him. "I knew it. I knew something wasn't right." She invited him inside for tea, and as the porcelain cups rattled in their saucers, the stories began to pour out. She spoke of seeing Leo left alone in the backyard for hours on end, in the summer heat and the autumn chill. She described Isabella's expensive cars coming and going at all hours, while the infants' cries could be heard from an open window, sometimes for an hour or more before they faded into exhausted silence. A house that big and that quiet. "It's not natural for children," she repeated, her words a somber echo of Arthur's own thoughts. "She hosts these grand parties, all for charity," she says. "The whole street is filled with cars. But the day after, the house is silent again. Like a museum, it was the first external validation, the first crack in Isabella's carefully constructed facade. Arthur knew he needed more than a neighbor's suspicions. He needed an expert, someone who could navigate the labyrinth of finance and law that Isabella used as her shield. He called Marcus Cole, a private investigator he'd used for corporate due diligence in the past. Marcus was a former military intelligence officer, a man who moved with quiet purpose and saw the world in patterns of truth and deception. He was precisely the ally Arthur needed. Marcus set to work immediately, his approach methodical and relentless. He began with Isabella's finances, and what he uncovered was both shocking and sickeningly logical. Isabella was drowning in debt. Her lavish lifestyle, the designer clothes, the luxury car, the constant social appearances, it was all a facade built on loans and credit. Her charity, the Thorn Foundation for Displaced Children, was a complete fabrication. It was a shell corporation, a legal entity with a bank account into which she funneled donations from her wealthy, unsuspecting friends. The children were not her beloved family. They were her most valuable assets, props in a cruel theatrical production designed to elicit sympathy and open wallets. This was the first major twist in the dark story, revealing a motive far more sinister than simple neglect. It was calculated, predatory fraud. While Marcus unraveled the financial web, Arthur turned his attention to a more personal search. Believing his sister must have left behind more than just a will, he obtained a court order under the pretext of his executorship to search the Bellevue Avenue house for personal documents. The house was just as he'd left it, cold, silent, and sterile. Guided by a strange intuition, he was drawn to the ornate desk in the study. Most of the drawers were unlocked, containing nothing but paid bills and stationery. But one, the bottom right, was locked. After a brief search, he found a small, antique key taped to the underside of the desk. He turned the key, the click echoing in the silent room. Inside, beneath a stack of old bank statements, was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was Elena's diary. His hands shook as he opened it. The first entries were filled with joy about her son, Leo. But as the pages turned, and her illness progressed, the tone grew darker, more fearful. The final entries, written in a weak, spidery script, were a desperate cry for help. "Isabella convinced me to sign over guardianship," she wrote. "She promised to love Leo as her own, to keep him safe until Arthur comes home. But I see the coldness in her eyes when she looks at my son. A flash of something, like resentment. I'm so afraid. I've left everything in a trust for the children, with Arthur as executor, but she has control of the house and their care until he returns. I pray he comes back soon. I pray I am wrong about her." Arthur had to sit down, the weight of his sister's final words crushing him. The diary was the smoking gun. It wasn't just proof of motive. It was a testament from the grave, a mother's final, desperate attempt to protect her child. Arthur took the diary straight to his lawyer, Evelyn Reed. Evelyn was a force of nature, a woman whose sharp intellect was matched only by her fiercer sense of justice. She had been his family's lawyer for years, a trusted advisor and a formidable presence in any courtroom. She sat in her leather chair, the city skyline behind her, and read the final entries of the diary without a word. When she finished, she closed the book gently and looked at Arthur. Her expression hardened into something between pity and rage. "This is it," she said, her voice low and firm. "This is motive, intent, and a clear, premeditated breach of fiduciary duty. Your sister was afraid for her child's life, and her fears were tragically justified." She steepled her fingers, her mind already several steps ahead. Combined with the financial evidence Marcus is uncovering, the shell corporation, the embezzled funds, Isabella Thorne is finished. Marcus arrived shortly after, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He laid out the evidence on Evelyn's large mahogany desk. Bank statements showing charitable donations being transferred directly to accounts at luxury boutiques, flight records for lavish trips Isabella had taken while claiming to be caring for the children, and a detailed timeline of her neglect, cross-referenced with Mrs. Gable's testimony. The picture it painted was monstrous. Evelyn absorbed the information, her strategic mind piecing it all together. "A quiet legal battle won't be enough," she declared, her eyes glinting with cold fire. "A woman like Isabella lives and dies by her public image. A private settlement or a hushed court case would allow her to spin the narrative, to play the victim. We can't allow that." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We need to destroy that image completely and irrevocably. We need to make it impossible for anyone to ever believe her again. We need to expose her in a forum where she feels safest, where her power is at its peak." Marcus, ever the pragmatist, had already anticipated this. He pulled up a file on his laptop. "She's being honored in 2 weeks," he said, turning the screen for them to see. "At the annual Children's Welfare Foundation Gala. She's receiving the Philanthropist of the Year award for her selfless dedication to orphan children." The irony was so profound it was sickening. Evelyn smiled, a slow, predatory smile that promised retribution. "That's our stage," she said. "That's where the truth will finally have its premiere." The plan was set. They would gather their evidence, secure their witnesses, and prepare for a confrontation that would bring Isabella Thorne's world crashing down around her. Isabella, however, was not one to be cornered without a fight. Sensing the shift in power and realizing Arthur was not the distant, disinterested uncle she had banked on, she launched a preemptive strike. She weaponized her public persona, using the very tools of deception she had perfected over the years. She filed a police report against Arthur, accusing him of forcibly taking the children. She painted a heart-wrenching picture for the authorities and her influential friends. A grieving, unstable brother, a reclusive billionaire who had suddenly appeared and, in his madness, had kidnapped her beloved nephew and nieces. It was a masterful performance of a concerned guardian, terrified for the safety of the children she was desperate to protect. 2 uniformed police officers arrived at Arthur's penthouse the next afternoon. The moment was tense. The nurse, Sarah, stood defensively in front of the nursery door. Arthur, however, remained perfectly calm. Evelyn had prepared him for this exact move. He invited the officers in, his demeanor one of quiet authority and cooperation. He led them not to a dark room, but to a bright, warm living area where Leo was sitting with a picture book, looking more peaceful than Arthur had ever seen him. He calmly presented the officers with the legal documents Evelyn had drawn up, a copy of his sister's will naming him executor of the estate, and a petition for emergency temporary custody filed that very morning, citing evidence of neglect. He then showed them the nursery, a pristine and loving environment, and introduced them to Sarah, whose professional credentials and calm report on the infant's improving health spoke volumes. The officers saw the truth before them. A safe, nurturing home, a concerned uncle with legal standing, and 3 children who were clearly well cared for. They apologized for the intrusion and left. The countermove had failed, but it served as a stark warning. Isabella was not going to simply fade away. She was going to fight back with the only weapons she possessed: a powerful public image and a complete lack of shame. The battle lines were drawn. The night of the Children's Welfare Foundation Gala arrived, cloaked in the deceptive glamour of high society. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel was a sea of jewels and tuxedos, a glittering testament to wealth and influence. On a raised dais at the front of the room, Isabella Thorne was radiant, bathed in the warm glow of the stage lights. She was accepting her award, a crystal statuette, and delivering a tearful, expertly crafted speech. "I don't do this for the accolades," she said, dabbing a perfectly dry eye with a silk handkerchief. "I do it for the children, for my brave, sweet little Leo, and for my 2 miracle girls, left in my care by my darling, departed cousin. It is my life's honor to provide them with the love and security they so richly deserve." The room erupted in applause. The deception was absolute, the performance flawless. At that moment, the grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Arthur Vance entered, flanked by Evelyn Reed. He wore a simple, dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him a figure of somber gravity in the glittering room. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, walking down the central aisle towards the stage. A hush fell over the crowd as heads turned, a ripple of confusion spreading through the audience. Isabella saw him, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "Arthur, what a surprise. I'm so glad you could make it, but as you can see, this is a private event." She tried to dismiss him, to turn him into an awkward interruption. A strange relative who didn't understand social cues. But Arthur did not stop. He walked up the side steps to the stage. One of the event organizers, assuming this was a planned surprise, perhaps a large donation, hurried over and offered him a microphone. Arthur took it. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried a weight that commanded the attention of every person in the room. "My apologies for the interruption," he began, his gaze fixed on Isabella. "My name is Arthur Vance. The children Mrs. Thorne just spoke of are my nephew and nieces, and I feel that the generous patrons of this foundation deserve to know the truth about tonight's honoree." A collective gasp went through the room. Isabella's face paled. "Arthur, this is not the time or the place," she hissed. But Arthur was no longer listening. He turned to the large screen behind the stage, where a slideshow of smiling children had been playing. "If you could please bring up the file labeled Thorne Foundation," he said to the technician. A moment later, the screen flickered, and Isabella's personal bank statements appeared, magnified for all to see. Arthur used a laser pointer to trace the flow of money. Donations from people in that very room, marked for child welfare, being funneled into a shell corporation and then paid out to luxury car dealerships, designer boutiques, and exclusive travel agencies. He then read a passage from his sister's diary, his voice cracking with emotion only once as he spoke Elena's final, fearful words. Isabella began to unravel. "Lies. These are all lies. He's a disturbed man, consumed by grief. He's trying to ruin me." But her protests were drowned out by the quiet, damning evidence. The final blow came not from Arthur, but from a small, gray-haired woman who Evelyn Reed gently escorted to the stage. It was Mrs. Gable. Terrified but resolute, she stood at the microphone and spoke in a simple, clear voice about the crying babies, the lonely little boy, and the endless stream of parties at the silent house. Her testimony was not dramatic. It was just the plain, devastating truth. That was when Isabella broke. The mask of poised philanthropy shattered, revealing the snarling, vicious creature beneath. "They were a burden," she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly thing. "That wretched, silent boy and those screaming brats. I deserved that money. I deserved it for all I had to put up with." Her confession, a torrent of pure, undiluted avarice and cruelty, hung in the horrified silence of the ballroom. In that moment of absolute self-exposure, two plainclothes detectives, alerted by Evelyn, moved quietly through the crowd and stepped onto the stage. Her reign was over. The downfall of Isabella Thorne was as swift as it was brutal. The gala scandal became the city's biggest news story, a spectacular fall from grace played out on the front pages of every newspaper. Stripped of her social standing, abandoned by the friends who had once clamored for her attention, she was left with nothing but the ugly truth of her actions. The legal proceedings were a formality. Faced with irrefutable evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and felony child endangerment, she was convicted on all counts. Arthur attended the sentencing. He watched as the woman who had brought such coldness into the lives of his family was sentenced to a long prison term. She looked small and pathetic in her drab prison jumpsuit, a ghost of the glamorous socialite she had once been. There was no triumph in it for Arthur, only a profound, somber sense of justice finally served. The Children's Trust Fund, which Isabella had been desperately trying to break, was now secure under his protection. Their future was safe. With the legal battles over, Arthur made a decision. The cold, sterile mansion on Bellevue Avenue held too many ghosts, and his own penthouse felt like a gilded cage. They needed a true home, a place of light and warmth, a place to heal. He sold both properties and bought a rambling, sun-drenched house on the coast, with large windows that looked out over the endless blue of the ocean and a sprawling green yard that sloped down to a private beach. Life found a new rhythm, dictated not by board meetings and stock prices, but by feeding schedules, nap times, and the quiet rediscovery of joy. The twin girls, named Lily and Rose by Arthur in memory of his sister's love for her garden, grew healthy and strong, their happy coos and gurgles filling the house with the music it had longed for. Leo slowly, cautiously, began to emerge from his shell of silence. He still didn't speak much, but the haunted, watchful look in his eyes was replaced by a boyish curiosity. He spent hours exploring the beach, collecting shells, and watching the seabirds. He started to draw, covering pages and pages with colorful pictures of the sun, the sea, and his new home. One bright, clear afternoon, several months after they had moved, Arthur was sitting on the porch, watching the waves crash against the shore. The girls were napping inside, and Leo was at a small table nearby, engrossed in his drawings. The air was filled with the scent of salt and the sound of gulls crying overhead. It was peaceful. It was safe. Suddenly, Leo put down his crayon. He got up from his table and walked slowly, deliberately, over to where Arthur was sitting. He stood before him for a moment, his expression serious. Then, for the very first time, he initiated contact. He wrapped his small arms around Arthur's leg and held on tight, burying his face against the rough fabric of his trousers. It wasn't a boisterous hug, but a silent, profound act of trust and belonging. It was an anchor. It was everything. Arthur felt a knot in his chest that he'd been carrying for a decade finally come undone. He gently placed his hand on Leo's soft hair, his own eyes welling with tears he did not bother to hide. The long, silent battle was over. The healing had begun. Some monsters don't have claws and fangs. They wear designer gowns and accept awards in grand ballrooms. They thrive in the shadows of polite society, preying on the most vulnerable among us, cloaking their cruelty in the language of charity and concern. But they forget that there are protectors in the world, quiet men and women of deep resolve who will not stand by and watch innocence be corrupted. Why must we remain vigilant for the children who cannot yet speak for themselves? And what does it say about the soul of our community if we fail to listen to their silence? The story of Arthur and his children is a powerful reminder that the greatest wealth is not what is held in a bank vault, but what is protected within the human heart. True strength is not found in dominance and deception, but in the quiet, unwavering compassion that shields the weak and gives voice to the voiceless. What did you think of Arthur's decisive actions to protect his family? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. We are grateful for your time and attention, and we wish you and your loved